Alright, so I have a really major video in production right now. Like, it's gonna be insanely long and in-depth, but because of that, my release schedule has thinned. I've been hard at work on it, but it's gonna be long. I've been working on it since before my Games of 2019 list. I just want to let you know that. Hello and welcome to another countdown. Nintendo is without a doubt one of my favorite game companies of all time. I think I have a habit of bullying them in my videos for entertainment purposes, but I like to think of it as the schoolyard trope of a boy making fun of a girl and bullying her because he has feelings for her. Nintendo consoles is a sentimental topic to a lot of people, and I do think pretty much everyone watching this has some sort of personal relationship with at least one of the consoles. And that's why I do predict this comment section getting a little bit heated. I usually consider it kind of cringeworthy when countdown makers have all sorts of disclaimers before they get into the content of the video, but for this, I do kind of want to make some things clear. First of all, even though I'm using the terms worst to best, this is very much based on my own personal opinions and biases. Your list could be completely different due to you focusing on different criteria and having a different taste in games than myself. It's totally alright for you to disagree, and I would love to hear your personal favorites and least favorites in the comments. These consoles are being rated on their libraries with a focus on Nintendo exclusives, how they have aged over time, the quality of their gimmicks, and the general lasting appeal of the console as a whole. I am not, however, considering secondary features like access to the internet and/or backwards compatibility for the purposes of this list, and that's important. Just because the Wii can play GameCube games doesn't mean the Wii is necessarily higher than the GameCube based on that alone. Finally, before we dive in, I just want to make it clear. These consoles all have something to offer. They all deserve praise in their own way, even with their faults. The first entry I'll be going over is by default the worst, but it's not bad or anything, just not as good as the other consoles. So yeah, let's start. I was torn at first on what I should put at the bottom of this list. It was either this or the number 6 entry, and they were my potential choices for two different reasons. But I think after consideration, the Wii U I think deserves this spot more than any other console. And the primary reason I think so is because it's the only home console they've officially released that I think actively reflected poorly on the company both in sales and in general concept. Nintendo has at some points been miles ahead of its competition, and at other points has been struggling to keep up, and I think the Wii U was the worst example of Nintendo being criminally behind the times. The Wii U's primary gimmick is its gamepad, which is a clunky looking 480p tablet that is hooked to the console. It's not unlike the Nintendo DS in theory, where the gamepad acts as a separate screen that can display different information than the TV screen. It was often used for maps and inventory screens, which wasn't so bad, and it could also be used as the only screen if you wanted. They showed that a lot in commercials where some kid is playing on the Wii U and his mom or dad or something wants to use the TV to watch sports or whatever. The console's gimmick took a risk that failed miserably. Unlike the Wii, which is a console that had a similar silly aesthetic and gimmick, it wasn't something people were intrigued by. There was no mass interest in Nintendo Land in the same way there was for Wii Sports, and the gamepad ended up holding the console back a lot. Even with its cool ideas here and there, third-party companies were faced with a whole second screen of content any potential ports would have to fill. Usually that turned off developer interest in the system, but if ports were made, they would usually just use the second screen as a mirror for the TV without anything unique. I know some of you are going to argue that this shouldn't affect the rating, but the ad campaign for the console was so bad. And if you don't want me to use the ad campaign as a reason to diss the console, I guess I'll make the point that the ad campaign is poorly thought out and out of touch in the same way that the console as a whole is poorly thought out and out of touch. I don't want to entirely diss the Wii U though. Even though I think it was really mishandled, I do think the gamepad can be a lot of fun in certain games, primarily the original Mario Maker and especially Nintendo Land. And there are a lot of great games in the library. There's fun to be had, and I wouldn't call the system bad. It was just held back by its concept. The console I picked for the number 6 spot is a console I picked for every different reason than the Wii U. It was not a console that was poorly handled or executed, and it was not held back by any major gimmicks. For the time it came out, it was probably the best console on the market, probably even of all time. But of all the Nintendo consoles, I think the original Nintendo Entertainment System is the only console that hasn't aged that well. Now, I know putting such an essential console in gaming in Nintendo history so low is a controversial act, and I want to make it clear to you that at this point in the list, I think all the consoles here and farther up are great in their own ways, and I don't have any major gripes with them in the same way I have gripes with the Wii U. But putting all that aside, the NES is a benchmark in entertainment history. There are so many essential games on this system that sparked all-time great franchises. Franchises like The Legend of Zelda, Fire Emblem and Metroid were introduced on this system, but other franchises like Mario and Kirby really found their footing here. And that's just talking about first-party franchises. I think the star of the show for third-party releases is Mega Man, who had games that are still looked back as some of the tightest and most fun 2D platformers, period. The console deserves all the praise and respect it gets. It really did lay the foundation for home consoles for the future, and was ground zero for so many new ideas and gimmicks. Some better than others, obviously. I mean, there's a lot of silly accessories for the console, but for me that adds to the charm. The reason I put the NES so low compared to other consoles is because it's super simple. I don't think there's anything the NES does individually better than all the other consoles. With the exception of Mega Man and maybe Mario, I don't see a lot of NES releases being considered in the discussion for the best game in a long-running franchise. It's not often I hear a lot of people who say Metroid on the NES is their favorite. The console is definitely a product of its time. A lot of games employ all sorts of obnoxious arcade tropes, like repetitive sequences and ridiculous unfair difficulty without checkpoints, in order to simulate more content and stretch the playtime, and for a lot of games it works to its detriment. It doesn't help that a significant portion of the NES games didn't even have save data. The games that generally age the best are 2D platformers. The Mario and Mega Man games are still classics that have aged like wine. Other games, especially the role-playing games, aged like fucking milk. So yeah, the Nintendo Entertainment System was a benchmark in gaming history. It's fantastic, and gaming wouldn't be the same without it. The only reason I place it so low is because from this point on, pretty much everything got better by most measurable figures. The gameplay and graphics of games were able to become more precise, and home console games began to shake loose a lot of arcade tropes and become their own unique kind of experience. Fuck off, Tanner! It's a nice suburban Sunday morning where you and your family are just relaxing, but there's a knock on the door. You open it and it's two Japanese men, and they say those famous words.
We would like to play.
The Wii was my first ever home console, and it will always have a special place in my heart because of that. I'll never forget the Christmas morning I got my Wii and booted up Super Mario Galaxy for the first time, and I'm sure a lot of you have your own experiences like that. The Wii is really interesting because it made a lot of the same decisions involving casual play and gimmick prioritization as the Wii U. However, unlike the Wii U, which is Nintendo's worst-selling home console, the Wii is their best-selling home console. Yeah. And thinking about why that is has given me a few possible reasons. I think one main reason is that the Wii had a gimmick that was not just better, it was also easier to understand and present to an audience. The gamepad of the Wii U and how to use it requires a lot more explanation than the Wii. For the Wii, you can just show like 3 clips of Wii Sports and people just instantly understand it. You shake the stick to do things, like bowl, or play golf, or spin in space, or play piano. The Wii came out in a time where motion controls were something many people saw as an innovation in gaming to come. Soon, we would have no need for buttons. Simple actions in video games could be done by shaking a stick, or shaking an attached stick or something. Time has passed, and it turns out that motion controls weren't the big game changers some people thought they were going to be. The precision and simplicity of a button seems to be too intuitive, and most people are comfortable with gaming as it was. Motion controls have kind of been relegated to a niche topic, and you can sometimes see Nintendo's a little bit bitter about that, considering all the weird stuff they put in the Joy-Cons. But that doesn't take away from the fact that when it came out, the Wii was super cool. Everyone wanted to try the bowling game, and that meant a lot of people bought a system. The library of the game is good, but one unfortunate thing is that the motion controls very often got in the way. The biggest offender is Skyward Sword, which made the game so much more high maintenance and stressful than it needed to be. My favorite game on the system, Xenoblade Chronicles, doesn't even use the motion controls. I also want to give special mention to the brand that came with the Wii, the Wii brand. The Wii came with a series of games all named after the console, such as Wii Play, Wii Sports, and Wii Fit. These games made extensive use of the Miis you could create as characters, and really stand out among the system's library for how promoted they were. Wii Sports is one of the best-selling games of all time. And trust me, I like it, but it's a very simple game. It was packed with the Wii to be fair, but the game's success is still stunning. The Wii was packed with this goofy, casual aesthetic, but you shouldn't let that trick you into thinking it's not an important console. It is, and it does have a lot of fantastic games. The Wii remotes are bizarre, but they're something you'll get used to. I've done my fair share of memeing on the Wii U already, and I don't want to keep doing that. But I think when looking at this next console, the critical and commercial performance of the Wii U is kind of essential to understanding how much of a step forward the Nintendo Switch was from the very beginning. Nintendo went into the Nintendo Switch really trying to right their wrongs. The Switch actively tried to make space for third-party developers. It had a gimmick that didn't force itself among players. And its marketing campaign, we make fun of millennial rooftop parties and dudes playing NBA 2K at basketball courts, but it showed a level of basic competence and understanding of their audience that can't be said about Wii U promotions. I'm talking about the Nintendo Switch and its ad campaign so much because it's really the only one in recent memory, but also because it was such a breath of fresh air. They had more charisma, employing this new effective minimalism that to me was just so clean and inspiring that I rebranded my YouTube channel around the console and its aesthetic. Switchy was born. Looking into the console itself, well, where do I start? My mind was blown when I first saw it. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It's a game console with home quality graphics on the go. You can put it in the dock to play on the TV or use it as a handheld, and you can use the Joy-Cons in all sorts of ways. You can use them as individual controllers the size of Twinkies, or use them together in a Joy-Con grip and make the square gaming controller, or you can use them sci-fi style. People criticize the Joy-Cons a lot, and to be fair, I can't understand why. They're not that comfortable. They're incredibly expensive thanks to all the kooky HD rumble gyroscope stuff they put in, and they also drift and lose that satisfying snap to the console after like a month of use. But I just think it's such a creative and interesting idea, even though I always go for my Pro Controller instead. The launch was a bit underwhelming, with only one real must-buy game, that being the new Zelda, which was also released on the Wii U the same day. But by the end of the year, we had one of the best first years for a Nintendo console in such a long time. With Zelda, Mario Odyssey, Splatoon 2, Xenoblade 2, and more, the Nintendo Switch had really picked it up and is really developing a great library for itself. And people are starting to notice. The Nintendo Switch is doing great in terms of sales, and has really brought Nintendo as a whole back in the spotlight from the punchline it was earlier in the 2010s. I think I should put more emphasis on the fact that you can take this console anywhere, because that itself is such a fantastic element to the Switch as a whole. The Switch manages to put more power than the Wii U had into a tablet a bit larger than my phone, and it works. Of course, you'll find better graphics and FPS on its competitors, but the fact that you can play all these games in the car or in between classes without needing a tangled mess of cables or a TV or anything crazy is just revolutionary to me. And it really has made efforts to change how multiplayer is done. Because it is both a home console and a handheld, it can be used as a console multiple people play on, or communicate and play games with other consoles, or both at once. And for some reason, that really blew my mind when it was first shown off. A Mario Kart LAN party with like 4 Switches and 8 people just seemed like magic. Now, there are some obvious problems with the Switch, and most of it has to do with the tech often being sloppy running games at embarrassing numbers, and a lot of choices involving Nintendo Switch Online, which I'm not here to defend. Those are problems, but I think in the long term they won't seem as damaging. The Switch gains its middle spot on this list because I still think there's room for its library to grow. But I do think the Switch will be fondly remembered down the line for its fantastic crossplay, great games, and release in tandem with a whole new marketing strategy.
Project Reality will be a reality to all home players as well. No other system will offer this dimension of realism. No other manufacturer can promise this scope of play.
I wasn't 100% sure about where to place the Nintendo 64 on this list. If you guys know me, you probably know that I'm a much bigger fan of role-playing games than I am action and platforming games, so the Nintendo 64's admittedly unfortunate lack of RPGs made me first think I wouldn't want to put it that high, just due to my own personal tastes. But after thinking about it and playing Banjo-Kazooie for the first time, I think I love the Nintendo 64 a lot more than I first thought. 3D as a concept in video games was very new at the time of the Nintendo 64. Some SNES games toy with the idea with isometric views of maps and use some spritey magic to give the feel of 3D, but the games weren't actually rendering 3D models. That was all for Nintendo until the introduction of their third mainline console, the Nintendo 64. And well, to be honest, they did not really need time to get used to the third dimension, because one of the first 3D platformers ever made is also seen as one of the best. In that way, it's very much like the United States Apollo 11 mission, in that somehow Nintendo was able to do something they had never done before and do it without any serious blunders or mistakes, almost perfectly. They did it so well you get kinda suspicious. The introduction of 3D changed a lot of Nintendo series, and the biggest examples I can think of are Mario and Zelda. These traditionally 2D series were completely reimagined to be played with a whole new axis, and it went pretty well. Ask any mainline video game journalism company, and they will likely tell you that the best game ever made is Ocarina of Time. And people debate that, and I have my own opinions, but it's still generally agreed that these games are good. And there are even more classics on the console, like Star Fox 64, the Rareware titles, the first Super Smash Bros., Mario Kart, and all sorts more. When it comes to RPGs, there aren't many notable ones, but there is Paper Mario, and that's a dope game. What 3D does is give so many games a whole new level of immersion to them. You're no longer an abstract 2D sprite used to represent something more complex. There are now more efforts made to show instead of tell, and that's nice. The 64 really is a benchmark in gaming history. It sparked 3D gaming as a whole, and it was able to tackle new ideas while also doing them well. Of course, looking back now, it's not as polished as it once seemed, and generally the 2D SNES sprites aged better, but I can't help but appreciate it. It's a good console, but it's definitely not the coolest looking one. The GameCube being this high was something I decided on pretty quickly, but I'm not sure why I was so set on it. When you look at it in terms of innovation, there's not much to look at it in terms of its specs. I mean, it was a big graphical improvement over the Nintendo 64, but it wasn't like bringing in any new big ideas or gimmicks. It wasn't like the jump from the Super Nintendo to the Nintendo 64, where gaming had basically been reinvented with the introduction of a new dimension and the need for new buttons and mechanics to adjust. It wasn't like the introduction of the Wii, where the Wii remote was being used for everything and people were excited to try that out. I think this did kind of affect its sales. With a lack of some serious bits or gimmicks to really help it stand out, the GameCube did not sell as well as a lot of other Nintendo consoles. But I should mention that although the GameCube wasn't very revolutionary in its core specs, it shouldn't be seen as a console that was playing it safe. Because the GameCube era of Nintendo is remembered as one of the most experimental periods in terms of their first-party titles. Their launch title was Luigi's Mansion. This game was their launch title. Not Super Mario 128 or something. Not a platformer. A Mario spin-off where Luigi navigates a haunted house. Then they make Wind Waker, which is a game that uses Nintendo's all-new specs and graphics to make the dream Zelda game, something everyone has been waiting for since Majora's Masks, and it was a cartoony, cel-shaded, solid color game with sailing. Mario 64's tight platforming and varied environments were followed up with Mario traversing an island resort cleaning up mud. A lot of these ideas and big changes were really controversial at the time, and I don't entirely blame people for not really realizing the genius of the GameCube at first. A lot of these ideas were kind of ridiculous. But in this age of a lot safer, less reimaginative video games, it's fascinating to look back at Nintendo during this era making changes that seem so random and overt. That's not to say we don't ever see series be reinnovated and rethought nowadays, but it's done today so much more subtly than the GameCube. And all I've talked about are the series with the big changes. There are plenty of series that just improved on previous installments and new franchises as well. Beyond its level of experimentation, the GameCube just has a fantastic library. Metroid Prime brought Metroid a whole new dimension and feeling of first-person exploration. Animal Crossing technically debuted on the Nintendo 64, but was re-released worldwide with all new features and started one of Nintendo's bigger franchises. Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door improved on Paper Mario's flaws, and really proved that Mario spin-off RPGs are worth taking seriously. Super Smash Bros. Melee, an attempted casual party game, became one of the most popular competitive fighting games of all time almost completely on accident. Pikmin was just such a weird idea that turned out so fantastic, with its bizarre concept and very enjoyable strategy and time management. Even when it wasn't breaking boundaries, the Nintendo GameCube was still pumping out fantastic game after fantastic game. It also has a really nice aesthetic with all the bleeps and bloops in that really nice intro. Alright, so we all know what number 1 is due to this cool trick called process of elimination, but I'm still going to give it the dramatic intro it deserves, because it really deserves one. The Nintendo GameCube was a great console with a fantastic library. It was great. It really took a step improving on the Nintendo 64 specs and focused on bringing new ideas to the games. But the interface and experience of booting up and playing the GameCube is not too different than that of the Nintendo 64. Like, it feels like a lot of GameCube games could have potentially functioned with downgraded graphics on the 64. But what's a console that was a step above its previous incarnation, had a fantastic library, but also had the ability to widen the scope of video games on such a level that it really proved games could be more than just high scores and charts? Well, it's the Super Nintendo. There was no question that this was going to be number 1. I can't think of a Nintendo console that has aged as well as the Super Nintendo. I can't think of a Nintendo console that has as many classics as the Super Nintendo. I can't think of a Nintendo console that's as good as the Super Nintendo. Let me just list off some games. Super Mario World, The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, Super Metroid, Chrono Trigger, Earthbound, Yoshi's Island, Kirby Superstar, Secret of Mana, Donkey Kong Country, Mega Man X, Castlevania, Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, Star Fox, F-Zero, and Super Mario RPG, just to name a few. These are all fantastic games, and I'm barely scratching the surface. I think one good thing this console has for me personally is the depth of its mechanics. So many games are simple enough to easily get into and not really feel intimidated, but they're also complex enough that I want to get good at them and learn how to play them. It's that sweet spot that I think the SNES hits really well. I just love the console. I usually try and stay away from the old equals good philosophy, but so many games on this console are either argued as the best in their franchise or as seen as incredibly influential parts. The Super Nintendo for me really feels like where the modern video game was born. Before it, games were much less about story and immersion and artistic expression. Not to say that older games are vapid, but the focus was a lot more on making something people can get good at and give quarters to. But the Super Nintendo really was a benchmark in video games being more than that. It wasn't just about the competition anymore. It wasn't about the high scores. It was about a story. It was about growing. It was about adventure. At its core, the Super Nintendo just has a fantastic library, and a lot of the other things I bring up here are kind of periphery. So, with that said,
where is the fucking virtual console? Like, I want to play Earthbound again. Waiting a month. I want to play Earthbound. I want to play. Who the fuck cares about Smash Money? We need good out. So many third-party